Hi, and welcome to the OT is In, the podcast where we merge the worlds of education and occupational therapy to empower families like yours. I'm Sarah Collins, your host, an occupational therapist and a homeschooling parent. I've experienced occupational therapy by supporting families for over 15 years, but also through seeking out support of my own children, so I'm right here in the trenches with you. Though there is not one way to educate your child, there is a lot to consider when individualizing an education. And the goal of this podcast is to explain some of the why behind what an occupational therapist is thinking so you can apply it to your own family. Especially with my three favorite topics: executive functioning, handwriting, and sensory processing. Each episode will be packed with practical tips, expert interviews, and real-life stories aimed at helping you to create a supportive learning environment for your child. So, grab your headphones and get ready to dive in of the collision of education and occupational therapy. I'm Sarah Collins from Homeschool OT, and I'm thrilled to have you with me on this journey of discovery. Hey, and welcome to today's episode of the OT is In podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Greta Eskridge, a second-generation homeschooler, former public school, high school teacher, and homeschool mom of 4. Greta is passionate about protecting children's innocence and combating the dangers of pornography in an increasingly digital world. We're purposefully airing this episode during the month where we're speaking of executive functioning skills, specifically response inhibition, aka impulsivity, because resisting porn, especially when unprepared, is difficult for everyone, yet is even more difficult for those who struggle with executive functioning. Greta shares the alarming statistics surrounding children's exposure to pornography, with the average age of first exposure being around 11 years old. And then she emphasizes the need for parental vigilance and proactive measures to protect children from accidental exposure. Throughout this episode, Greta shares her expertise on the importance of open communication with children about online safety, explaining the why to our kids and providing engaging alternatives to screen time. So join us as we delve into this critical topic and learn how parents can work together to keep their children safe, preserve their innocence, and cultivate meaningful connections in an increasingly digital age. So stay tuned for an informative and empowering discussion with Greta Eskridge on today's episode of the OT is In podcast. In episodes 25 through 28, you will hear us touch on response inhibition and the many ways the skill is required. Safety awareness in play, and especially on screens. You'll also hear some ways to help build the skill, like in equine therapy, and you'll hear how to prepare for an emergency or a disaster. Preparations are important for all, but require more emphasis when considering sensory needs and executive functioning skills. If any of these resonate with you, there's an additional resource at Homeschool OT. We've made a games list so you can be intentional about adding fun to your homeschool day, knowing that you're also addressing executive functioning skills. You can find this in the Homeschool OT shop or in the show notes for each of these episodes. And for further support in the area of executive functioning, we have the Executive Functioning Focus Group. This is a month-long deep dive into each of the 11 executive functioning skills. Each week, you'll have bite-sized chunks to grow your understanding, but also how to help build the skills, adjust the environment to support your children, and even ways to adapt activities. After all, we want our expectations to match our children's abilities. For those of you worried about dedicating a month to this topic, don't worry. You have lifetime access, so you can come back as your time allows or as your child develops and you need to, again, match your expectations to their new abilities. So you can find out more about the focus group at homeschoolot.com, or more specifically, homeschoolot.com/shop/executive-function-focus-group. Now, on with the show. Hey, and welcome back to the OT is in. Today I have Greta Eskridge, who is known for many different things, but primarily I have known Greta through her talk and her work on combating porn for our kiddos and how to talk to them. And also, actually, on her books about adventure, which is super fun. And one of the things we were just talking before we got on air here about my son, who is right now has walking pneumonia, but typically is on the move all the time and up for adventure continuously. So we have used that book in the past. Your 100 Adventures, is it 100 or
Yeah,
101?
100 Days of
What,
Adventure.
100,
Yeah.
100, yes. So we went through that several years ago, which was super fun. But today, Greta, can you just start first by telling us who you are and what your story, your homeschooling story is?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here. And I am a second generation homeschooler. So my mom homeschooled, my mom and dad homeschooled my brother and I in the 80s and 90s and absolutely loved it. And I became a public high school teacher. My first time attending public school was as a ninth
So
and 12th
cool.
grade. And it was a lot of fun. I loved it. But I always knew I wanted to homeschool my kids when I had them. So as soon as we started having babies, I left teaching in the public school and became a homeschool teacher to my first newborn son and then more kids to come. So now we have four kids, three boys, one girl. Our oldest is 20. He's graduated. Our next is 18. He just graduated. And then we have a
Wow.
16-year-old and a 13-year-old. Like it makes me teary eyed to think like I'm on the tail end of
Yes,
homeschooling.
you are.
It's been the most beautiful journey of my life. This opportunity to spend time with my kids every day. Yes, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I would hide in my room because I needed a break. But I would say overall, it's been incredible to be a homeschooling mom for all these years. And along the way, I started writing and sharing about everything in our life online. And that grew into speaking and writing two books so far. My third book will be out in the spring of 2025. And I have a podcast. So, yeah, I'm just a lady who loves to talk and loves to write and share about things that I think really matter, which are preserving childhood and protecting kids' innocence and helping families cultivate connection.
I love that. So, how did you get into this, the protecting kids' innocence? Like, what led you in that on that path?
I think probably similar to every parent out there. I started simply because I was like, I got to protect my own kids.
Mhm.
This is a real life problem that's happening. And it wasn't like pornography wasn't an issue I dealt with as a child or a teen. I was never exposed to pornography. That's largely because pornography was really so much harder to come by at that time. Like it wasn't on the internet. Like I didn't even
Right.
have an email address till I was in college. Like I grew up in a different time, but our kids are living in a completely different world than that. And when my son was born 20 years ago, the internet was just starting to become a thing. And so by the time he was 7, 8, 10 years old, and then I had all these other kids coming along behind him, like I had to really think about how would I protect my kids. So that's where I started was like, I want to protect my kids from pornography and the hurt and the damage I know it
Mhm.
causes because like interacting with people, you just start to hear the stories. And then I found as I began to learn more that I wanted to invite other moms, especially into the conversation, because I knew it could be so much more effective to talk to my kids about pornography and protect them if I had a community of like minded families
Yes.
around us. But I was like, oh, nobody wants to talk about this really, but they also still want the information. And I had a podcast at the time and I was doing it with a bunch of friends. And I was like, you guys, we need to talk about pornography. And they're like, no way. That's so scary and overwhelming. And I was like, no, we really need to. I think it would be effective and like important to help parents, the moms who are listening. And so I did the whole episode, and like the result was so many parents said, okay, we need this information. Thank you. And
Mhm.
from that podcast, the requests just kept coming. People were like, we want to hear more. We want to know more. Will you come speak at our church? Will you speak at our homeschool convention? And eventually I had the nickname the porn lady, which is something I never wanted
Yeah,
in
like,
my
is
life.
that good or
I
bad?
mean, my husband has said to me, did you ever think you would have the nickname the porn lady? I'm like, no, never. I couldn't even say the word out loud in front of him or to my closest friends for a long
Right.
time. But just the need was there, and people are hungry for help. And I want to help not just kids and families, but I think it's an opportunity to create generational change, because if we help kids now, then it's helping them in the future. It's helping them when they're teenagers, when they get married, it's helping their kids. This is an opportunity for generational change. So that's what I'm doing.
So important. Now, we here at OTs, and we are airing this topic during a month, like when we're focusing primarily on executive functioning, specifically what's called response inhibition or impulsivity, impulse
Mhm.
control, things like that. Kiddos who would struggle with safety awareness. However, our kids have access to devices at younger and younger ages and may be exposed to this at younger and younger ages. Do you know the average range or age range or statistics about like when the first exposure occurs?
Yeah, typically the average age for first time exposure is around 11. But a lot of experts are saying it's even younger, sometimes as young as 8, because kids are on devices so much starting even in preschool, and they can accidentally find or be exposed to something. Accidental exposure, those are not like 8-year-olds or 11-year-olds who are going in search of porn. They're
Right.
the ones who are exposed to it accidentally. It is not their fault. I actually think the pornography industry is coming after them. So, yeah, it's happening to young kids.
Yeah. And I would even say our statistics now, I'm going to be honest, I've not looked this up, but our statistics for kiddos who do have response inhibition struggles or can't stop, or when they see
Yeah.
something, they do it right away, that age would lower and the instances would increase.
Yeah, I can
Do you,
imagine. You're right.
yeah,
I
that's
don't
it.
know specifically for that category, but because I haven't seen it broken down for a specific for those specific categories, but I would imagine that the chance of not so much the chance of exposure, because I think that's just across the board, kids
Right.
of any age. But I think going back to it, like being exposed and then being like, oh, wow, what is this? I'm
Mhm.
curious. I have strange feelings when I see this. I can't stop looking at it. Like, so the repeated exposure that comes after that initial exposure, that is that is dangerous and possible for any kid. But for a kid who has already an issue with struggling with those types of like self control and
Yeah. And the
like
stop and think.
exactly, like their prefrontal cortex is it's underdeveloped for any
Mhm.
kid, but for
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
more so than others, they're the ones that are more at risk.
Right. Yeah, we talk about there's a developmental range, obviously, in this prefrontal cortex, but in general, around 11 is when those skills really start to come in, and our
Mhm.
expectations have to meet what our specific child's developmental stage can be. So,
Right.
knowing that, like, how do we talk to our kids about this?
I think there's two really important things that we need to do. We need to be really honest. So we need to not be afraid to say, first of all, here's what pornography is, and give them a real clear and basic definition, and then be honest with, here's what could happen when you see it. And the reason those two things are important is because sometimes as parents, we are like, I don't want to say anything because I don't want them to think about it or be curious and then go look for it. And of course, that is a possibility. But you're not just saying, hey, there's this thing called porn. It's pictures of movies of naked people. There you go. That's not
Right.
what you're, that's
Hey.
not, you're continuing the conversation and you're saying, when there's this thing called pornography and it's pictures and movies of people with no clothes on, and it is something that is not good for you. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your brain. It's not good for your heart. And so I'm going to tell you what to do if you see it, because it's my job to keep you safe from things that are not good for you. And so that's the continuation of the conversation. And then you give them tools for what to do if they see it. And for any kid, but especially a kid who struggles with being able to stop doing something that is not good for them, you need to give them real specific things. And I would say go so far as act it out, like
Yeah.
role play this, talk through it, talk about it like once a month, bring it up. But you can say something so specific as, if you see this when you're on your computer or on my phone or playing a game on the tablet, or if somebody shows you on the bus or at the baseball game, here's what I want you to do. You, if you're on the computer or a tablet or a phone, you close it, you turn it off, you turn it over. If somebody shows it to you, you say, I don't want to look at that, in your strongest voice possible. And then you get up and you leave. And if you're looking at it or you see it on a device, put it down, leave it there, leave. Helping them physically leave the place where they're seeing it is a really great way to break that impulse that's telling them keep looking, right? And then come tell me or daddy or some other trusted adult. So you give them a definition, but you then give them something to do.
To do.
The reason why, so not just it exists, but the reason why they shouldn't look at it, and then something to do. And like I said, act it out, like role play, talk about it. When you're going for a walk 3 weeks after you have the initial conversation, hey, remember we talked about that thing called pornography? Do you remember what it is? And then give them a chance to tell it back to you. Do you know what you're supposed to do if you see it? Don't have the conversation one time. That is like, doing that right there is going to go so far in helping them. And then the part two of that, in that honest conversation, is I think, like I said, it's really important to tell them, here's what could happen if you see pornography. And this is not where you're going to be like doomsday. I
Right.
want you to be honest with them about what they're experiencing, because this is where parents get so uncomfortable. We don't want to say, you could be curious and want to look at it some more. You might have a feeling in your body that it feels like, either it might feel yucky, but it also might feel good. And like parents were like, oh, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to think about that. There's nothing wrong with your kid. That
Right.
is normal human. We are built as sexual beings. And so we're built to have a response. And I think it's important for our kids, especially a kid who is neurodivergent or in that realm, for them to know those feelings that they're experiencing, or curiosity, questions, those are normal. They are not bad. And what they need to do with it is to come to you.
I love that. I think that's so important. And a few things that you said in there, like to give them something to do and to separate from that. And that's so
Yeah.
much what we talk about as far as anytime with response inhibition. Like we need to redirect that in a
Mm,
way that it is safe. And even if we've talked a couple times on the podcast about like safety seekers or looking out, like how are we going to find and make sure that we are safe? And so this is I need to move my body
yeah.
away from it, which in OT, I'm like, oh, we're giving them proprioception, which helps to calm their nervous system. There's so many different things. But as you're doing that and calming the nervous system, then you are able to think more clearly, get out of that just immediate response, and then come up with what you do need to do in that situation, which should be, yes, I'm going to go talk to my mom. I'm going to tell her what I saw or whatever, and then figure out what do we do from here. Before we go on, I want to take a second to thank you for being here. Many of you started listening to the OT is In podcast after hearing some of my sessions during the convention season in June. I am so thrilled that you are all here, and I so appreciated your feedback. One person, after attending my session, Help, My Child Won't Sit, gave feedback to the Virginia convention saying, I wish we had more time with her. This was such a blessing. Well, here I am. And another person said, I loved the tips and tricks. I can always use more. So here's another tip, especially for those of you whose children learn better with the ability to move. We've used CTC Math for a few years now. Each lesson is short and engaging, allowing for movement before and likely after. One of my sons completes his math lessons after completing his chores, which provide him with the pushing, pulling, carrying, or crawling, all the activities we OTs call proprioceptive feedback or heavy work. Then he sits on a sit disc or on a balance ball, and since all lessons are online, he moves wherever he feels the most comfortable. He's engaged in the lesson, and then a short time later is up and moving again with a better understanding of math. So if you're looking for short yet effective, colorful, engaging lessons, CTC Math is a perfect addition to your homeschool. Now back to the show. I love that so much. Now, I also know if I'm reading your books and hearing you speak, like part of what you're doing is also talking about other ways to occupy your time, like giving our, which you hear my occupation, right? We want to have this healthy development and providing alternatives. What are your favorite ways to go about this with your kids?
I think one of the best things we can do is to make being off of screens so
Mhm.
attractive and so desirable. That's their number one thing that
Go
they
to.
turn to. Because let's be honest, screens are easy,
Mhm.
screens are attractive because they are so easy. And not just for kids, they're easy
Right.
too. Like
Mhm.
I remember when we got a minivan and we had a 4-year old, a 2-year old, and a newborn, and we're like, it is time. Like we need a minivan. And we purposely did not get screens in our minivan, like because, and this is not to bash anybody who has screens in their car. This was an understanding of ourselves as parents. We knew that it would just be so easy to use those to babysit our kids when they were fussy,
Mhm.
when it was a long drive or whatever. Like it would just be the easy default. We would say, oh, yeah, we're going to save it for their long road trips. But pretty soon we just knew like that would be so easy. And there's nothing wrong with using screens to help you when you're having a rough day, when you're sick, or even to use them for teaching your kids. But it is very easy for you as a parent, and I'm speaking for myself as well, to overuse them. So instead, if we can give our kids the opportunity to do other things, be outside, play in the mud, get as dirty as possible, make a mud kitchen, go being outside like with their friends. So our homeschool group, we hike together every week. And my kids are much more apt to, especially when they were younger, to do longer, harder hikes because their friends were with them. That made it
Mhm.
attractive. That made it more fun. Great snacks. Like you want to go invite everybody to go hang out in the backyard instead of sit around the TV and watch something. Like put out a blanket, put out an awesome snack tray, and be like, hey, we're going to read aloud outside. Suddenly you've elevated the experience. So
Mhm.
it's all about making whatever you're doing that's away from screens so much more attractive. They're like, yeah, I want to be a part of that.
Love that. Now, a lot of the families that I work with here at Homeschool OT, it can be really hard to have kids outside and have kids who don't necessarily always fit in because they
Ah,
are neurodivergent and don't necessarily fit in with this group. And oftentimes they can find friends in two different ways, like proximity or with common interests. And a lot of those common interests are screen related games, Minecraft, Fortnite, whatever, that they are playing in groups here and there. Do you know, and you may not, but do you know, like within those types of groups, is porn often an issue there as well?
poof.
Hey, I'm throwing
This
hard
is
stuff out.
I'm so glad you asked this because this is something that parents need to be really aware of. And I think a lot of parents aren't because like nobody's talking about it. But video games, whether they're on a computer, through a phone, or through a gaming console like a Nintendo Switch or something you plug into your TV or computer, those are a very common way for kids to be exposed to pornography or to be exposed to sexual predators. And the reason that happens is because a lot of times these games are played with other people. So
Mhm.
you're basically, imagine this, you're setting your child in front of a screen to play with strangers from all over the world that you have no idea who they are, how old they are, or anything about them. And you're inviting them not just like into your living room or your child's bedroom, but into your child's life. And then
Yeah.
they have complete access to your child. And so I hear from parents often who say, my kid was playing such and such a game, Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite, and then a
Mhm.
whole slew of others. And this person contacted them and sent them pornographic images or became their friend online, talking to them. A lot of times the kids are wearing, you don't even
Headphones,
know who
right.
they're talking to, right? Because you don't want to hear the sound of the game. And so you have no idea who's talking to them directly into their ears, becoming their friend, grooming them, and then asking for videos or of that child to take of themselves and send, or saying, let's meet up. And yeah, we have to be really careful. Games are so attractive to kids. We worked really hard to limit our kids' screen time, and they really didn't have a lot, but games are so attractive, especially to boys. They just
Mhm.
love them. You got to find a balance. And sometimes you have to take a hard line and say, this game is not okay because it is not safe for you. I'm sorry, all of your friends are playing it, and I know you feel left out, but it is not a safe game for you. Or you set up the parameters. You're not playing with anybody else. You can play
Mhm.
this where it's just you playing the game, but you cannot have access to anybody else and they can't have access to you.
Oh, my heart. Oh, it is so scary. And not to be a fear monger, right? That's not
Yeah.
our purpose here. But I think for many families that I've talked to, when it's difficult to be because they want to keep their children safe, it's hard
Yeah.
when we don't have this outdoor safety awareness, or,
Yeah.
your kid has to be around you all of the time
Mhm.
so that you can be watching them. It's oftentimes we feel like it's safer just to let them be on a screen for a
Oh, of
while, and then now we're
course.
looking at, just kidding, that's actually not
And
that
it
safe.
doesn't mean that your child can't ever be on a screen. It just means you need to be extremely involved in their screen time activity. And there are things that you can put into place. You can use a router in your home because for kids under the age of 10, and sometimes even under the age of 12, depending on where you stand as a family with screens, especially 10 and under, most of the time that accidental exposure to pornography is going to happen in the home. If you use a router, then that helps protect the information that's coming into your home. And you can apply the same kind of idea to when your kids are playing games. So you set up ground rules, like you can't play games where you're playing with strangers. You can't play games with your headphones on. I need to know who's talking to you and who you're talking to. You can't play games by yourself in your bedroom. You play in a public space. I'm looking at what you're doing. The account is set up through me. Like there's all kinds of things that we can put into place to protect our kids. So we're empowered to protect them. They're even empowered to protect themselves. We're not responding out of fear or panic. We're saying, I am equipped to protect my kids. My kid is equipped to protect themselves.
What a mindset switch, and that is beautiful. And especially if you've already had these conversations with your kids, and when you're saying the underlying why isn't because I want you to be separate from everybody else or
Mhm.
you're going to be different, but it's to make sure that you know how to protect yourself. Oh,
Yeah.
I love that language. That's so good. So, are there any other resources for parents that we have not chatted about here?
Yeah, there's actually so much out there for parents to be helped. When I first started talking about this, was probably, I feel like it was like 8 years ago. And there really wasn't very much, but it's growing because parents are recognizing their need for help in this area. And I would say if you're looking for tech help, like how to set up that router, which router to use, with that kind of information that you're looking for, I recommend my friend Chris McKenna and his company, his organization rather, is called Protect Young Eyes. And he has a plethora of information about the whole tech side of it. How do we keep our kids safe in the home with a router? He talks about like apps, what apps, and goes through what apps are safe, which ones are like absolutely not. So if you check out his website, it's extraordinarily helpful. If you're curious about like how to talk to your kids, like to have that conversation that I touched on, the conversation about pornography, and you're like, I can't do that by myself, then you could use a book. There's a book that's out. It's called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. And that's a
We've
great
read
book
that
for
one too.
parents.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very.
it's a great one for parents who are like, I can't do this. Another book that's great for parents who have kids 12 and up is the book called How to Talk to Your Kids About Pornography. And it is a great book for you to read with your kids. I always tell parents, don't just give your kids a book and say, read
Right.
this and get informed. Read it with them, have conversations with them. So that one's great if you have like preteens and teens and you want to go into a little more depth. And then I have, of course, all kinds of articles and podcast episodes where I'm talking about these like topics. So there's a lot out there,
Yeah.
and parents are not alone. We're really not alone. There's a lot out there to help you guys.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here. And how can people find you?
Oh, yeah. I have a website, gretaeskridge.com, and that's where you're going to find like those articles that I mentioned. And then my podcast is the Greta Eskridge podcast. And I have some episodes with my friend Chris McKenna and a bunch of other people who are talking about keeping kids safe online and just in the world in general. And then on Instagram, my handle is Ma and Pa Modern, but you can just look me up by my name, Greta Eskridge. And that's where I'm the most active, talking about all kinds of things related to those things I mentioned, keeping kids safe and preserving childhood, cultivating connection. I'd love to see you guys there.
Oh, I love it. And we will make sure all of this is linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here and for tackling this tougher subject, something that isn't comfortable, that we don't want to talk about that easily, but is very necessary for parenting and for our kids' safety.
I'm so glad you had me on to talk about it, because the more we as parents talk about it, then the more it becomes something that we're all joining in together to keep kids safe. And that's what needs to happen.
Absolutely.